The first thing that comes to mind whenever we hear the name Solomon, aside from all his reputed wisdom, is his great temple, which adorned the heart of ancient Jerusalem. Some have said that if David represents Jerusalem's heart, Solomon represents its soul. The biblical narrative reads,
ויהי כחלות שלמה לבנות את בית השם, ואת בית המלך, ואת כל חשק שלמה אשר חפץ לעשות. וירא השם אל שלמה שנית, כאשר נראה אליו בגבעון, ויאמר השם אליו, שמעתי את תפילתך, ואת תחינתך אשר התחננת לפניי. הקדשתי את הבית הזה, אשר בנית, לשום שמי שם, עד עולם, והיו עיניי, וליבי שם כל הימים.
Such importance is ascribed to this holy shrine that we might go as far as to say that the real history of Israel as a kingdom begins not with King Saul or even with King David, who some argue may have been little more than petty chieftains, but with Solomon, who, for better or for worse, solidified what had been a tribal confederacy into a true monarchy. As with David, the natural place to look for archaeological evidence of Solomon is Jerusalem. Yet religious restrictions have made digging in most of the promising areas effectively off limits. That includes the natural ridge extending south from today's Temple Mount, the so-called Ophel, an extension of which is the so-called City of David. The Kidron Valley is situated to the east, the Valley of Hinnom to the south. Modern geopolitics is ever in the mix, as much of the area is densely occupied by Palestinian Arab homes, the owners of which are by no means interested in assisting Israelis in substantiating their ancient history and claims on the land. The biblical account supplies great detail regarding the construction, the dimensions, and the interior furnishings of the temple, which was ultimately destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in the year 586 BCE. A second temple was later constructed on the site and dedicated in the year 515 BCE. And after that, King Herod built his own magnificent temple. Today, the site is occupied by the great Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, making excavations of any kind impossible. But back in the 19th century, access was considerably less complicated. Meet Lieutenant Charles Warren, a 27-year-old military mining expert dispatched by the Palestinian Exploration Fund in the year 1867 to explore the fortifications of the city of David, the authenticity of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the site of Solomon's Temple. Earning the nickname the Mole, he began digging on the Temple Mount, known in Arabic as Haram al-Sharif. An unaccountable rumor arose that I had arrived on a very sinister mission, that I was to place small packets of gunpowder around the sanctuary walls at a great depth, and then, when they had grown and developed over the course of years into barrels of gunpowder, I was again to come and fire them in order to destroy the grand old walls. Pressure mounted on the Ottoman authorities, and Warren was subsequently barred from digging anywhere in the vicinity of the Muslim shrine. Not to be deterred, he found another way. Any proprietor of land could dig in his own ground, and if I made my bargain with the proprietor, I was really only digging for him. Accordingly, I picked out a spot along the south wall, concealed behind some prickly pears where we worked down along the wall in security. I dug vertical shafts all the way to bedrock, then tunneled perpendicularly to the Holy Hill. Undetected for months, I was able to map the whole topography of ancient Jerusalem. To this day, Warren's work remains the best picture we have of the Temple Mount. But it's just a partial picture at best. Jumping ahead by more than a century, Professor Benjamin Mazar of the Hebrew University began a collaboration with Dutch-born archaeologist Leon Rittmeyer in the 1970s to find any evidence of the first great temple of Solomon. Referring to the works of the ancient Greek historian Strabo, the team spent 5 years exploring the site. At the lowest course level, they found masonry of a different variety than that of subsequent periods, identifying it as most likely the original footings of the temple. In an account for the Biblical Archaeology Society, Rittmeyer described sections of the rock directly underneath the golden dome of the Muslim shrine, cut completely flat, which north to south have a width of 6 cubits, precisely the width attributed by the Mishnah, Midot 2:1, to the wall of the Holy of Holies. Rittmeyer proposed that these flat sections constitute foundation trenches, on top of which the walls of the original temple were laid. Amazingly, in the floor of the dome of the rock was a carved rectangular depression, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide, exactly the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant, according to the book of Exodus.
ועשו ארון עצי שיטים 2.5 ארכו, ואמה וחצי רחבו, ואמה וחצי קומתו.
Rittmeyer also established that one of the steps ascending toward the Dome of the Rock is quite possibly the top of a stone course from the pre-Herodian western wall of the Temple Mount platform. This identification is not without its problems, since, according to Josephus, there were 31 steps up to the Holy of Holies from the lower level of the Temple Mount. And according to the Mishnah, 29 steps in total, each step being 0.5 cubit in height. This amounts to a height of at least 22 feet, while the height of the Sahara, or rock in Arabic, is only 21 feet above the lower level of the Temple Mount. Still, the measurements are close enough that we ought to pay serious attention to what might be the actual spot where Solomon's temple stood and where the Ark once rested. In spite of all this, there's no end of controversy over whether Solomon's temple even existed. The debate even has political overtones, since some among the Palestinian Arab population, even among the leadership, have claimed that the existence of the temple is a fiction and that Jews have no claim to Jerusalem. That said, there are certain additional artifacts that make reference to the temple, such as the so-called Temple Ostracon, now residing at the Israel Museum of Jerusalem. It's just a pottery shard dating from around 800 BCE, but it bears ancient Hebrew script featuring the words Bet Hashem, the house of God. If there had been no temple, why would there be even a single potsherd mentioning it? Then there's an ostracon from roughly the same period that's basically an ancient tax receipt for a contribution of 3 shekels to the house of the Lord. Additional evidence includes a small ivory pomegranate vase with a long neck and petals. It dates to around 750 BCE, the reign of King Uzziah of Judah. It bears an inscription around its shoulder in Paleo-Hebrew script reading, "Sacred donation for the priests of the house of the Lord." It appeared anonymously on the antiquities market in 1979 and was bought in the 1980s by the Israel Museum of Jerusalem for a price tag of $550,000. It was thought to be the most important artifact in the entire collection of biblical antiquities. But in 2004, allegations arose that it was in fact a fraud. In 2004, Israeli antiquities collector Oded Golan was indicted for forging antiquities, including the pomegranate, the first time a criminal court had been brought into such a case. Golan was ultimately acquitted in March 2012, though the pomegranate wasn't included in the individual counts, including in the judge's findings. In late 2008, Professor Yitzhak Roman concluded that the inscription shows no indication of having been forged. To this day, the matter remains unresolved. There is, of course, more evidence to consider. In the summer of the year 2000, another inscribed tablet was found on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem by the Islamic Trust renovators of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The tablet has subsequently been held by Oded Golan. It consists of 15 lines of Hebrew text with some elements of Aramaic and Old Phoenician. The contents are, to say the least, significant, as it describes repairs made to Solomon's temple on the order of King Joash in the 600s BCE. The tablet relates how Joash ordered the priests to take holy money, to buy quarry stones and timber and copper, and labor to carry out the duty with faith. Israel's Geological Institute dated the inscription as approximately 2,800 years old. It was also reported that flecks of gold had been burned into the stone, suggesting that it may have been in the temple at the time it was burned by Babylonian invaders in the year 586 BCE. But in December 2004, Oded Golan was charged with faking dozens of items, including the Joash tablet. Among the naysayers was Palestinian archaeologist Hani Nur al-Din of East Jerusalem's Al-Quds University, who suggested that for some, sensationalism and publicity is more important than good scholarship and peer review. But despite the scientific testimony against Golan, the consensus was that the prosecution had failed to make its case. We should also consider Eilat Mazar of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who drew attention after excavating a wall she says was built by the biblical King Solomon in the 10th century BCE, to which Hani Nur al-Din declared she doesn't give any archaeological context to her findings other than dating pottery shards. The Bible should be put aside. It's not a history book. Mazar, scion of an illustrious Israeli archaeology dynasty, retorted, excavating Jerusalem without knowing the Bible is impossible, insisting that the Bible offers what she calls a core of reality. She also declared, we've got a fantastic 10th century fortification line that indicates a central, powerful regime. The Bible tells us there was such a king at this time, and his name was Solomon. Why ignore it? The question is if we can trace that core and prove it existed. Well, here it is. Solomon is also credited by some with building the so-called Milo, a terrace system in Jerusalem, which, at the end of the day, may instead represent a substructure for King David's palace. Leaving the Jerusalem controversies to simmer, let's also consider some locations said to have been built by Solomon, such as the border fortress of Etzion Geber. Nelson Gluck was the first to excavate the site of Tel El Khalife between 1938 and 1940, thinking that this might be the remains of Etzion Geber. But in 1965, he reevaluated some of his conclusions and rejected the identification. Some connections were also found between Tel El Khalife and what were presumed to be Solomon's copper mines at Timnah, 15 miles to the north, including copper fish hooks and copper slag. But the link between Timnah and Solomon has also been reevaluated, and today it's largely rejected. Hetzion Geber is still undiscovered, but might well be located under the modern shipyards of Jordan on the Gulf of Aqaba. Then there are the 3 royal cities that the Bible records as Solomonic. We read,
וזה דבר המס אשר העלה המלך שלמה לבנות את בית השם, ואת ביתו, ואת המילו, ואת חומת ירושלים, ואת חצור, ואת מגידו, ואת גזר.
Flash back to the year 1902. A 21-year-old Irishman, Robert Alexander Stewart McAllister, opened excavations at Gezer. Work continued on the site for 7 years, yielding numerous discoveries. I identified a large complex on the south side of the Tel as a palace dating from the days of the famed Jewish freedom fighters in whose honor the Feast of Hanukkah is celebrated yearly, the Maccabees. But I couldn't identify anything as Solomonic. The archaeological focus next shifted to the fabled Galilean city of Megiddo. William Flinders Petrie began digging down to the remains from the 7th millennium BCE. Over time, some 30 ancient cities layered one on top of another were identified. Megiddo happens to be the only site mentioned in all the great archives of the ancient Near East, Assyrian, Egyptian, and Hittite, as well as the Bible. In 1925, the Oriental Institute of Chicago began a 14-year dig. Among numerous finds, the archaeological team identified the famous Stables of Solomon, due to several biblical verses stating that Solomon built up Megiddo and that Solomon had many horses. But identifying these remains as Solomon's stables has also been debunked by some, who claim that they represent either barracks or storerooms. In any case, the most important find was near the stables, where a set of walls with a unique tower gate and guardhouse were ascribed to Solomon. But Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein argued that such remains should be dated to at least a century after Solomon, the so-called Finkelstein correction. Attention then shifted to the northern Galilean city of Hatzor. Its impressive tell bears witness to the importance of the site, the Bible referring to the king of Hatzor as the king of Canaan. The year 1955 saw the launch of the largest excavation ever undertaken under renowned Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin. He hoped to find remains from Solomon's days and perhaps even the great king's royal archive. What he found was a city wall similar to the one at Megiddo. At the end of the wall, Yadin sketched an outline based on the Megiddo gate. He told his excavators to dig there. Lo and behold, the gate appeared exactly where Yadin had marked it. He labeled it as a Solomonic 6-chambered gate. Pottery remains led Yadin to date it to the 10th century BCE. In an amazing piece of detective work, Yadin suspected that Megiddo's gate complex mirrored those from the same period found at Hatzor and presumably Gezer. But he still was troubled. Why wasn't a similar gate found at Gezer? He reviewed Robert McAllister's original report of 1912 of Gezer and realized that if you add another half to his Maccabean palace, you have a structure almost identical to the Hatzor and Megiddo gates. Since McAllister hadn't used pottery to properly date Gezer, he misidentified the gate as a Maccabean castle. Yadin considered it the greatest triumph of his career. He declared,
"There is no example in the history of archaeology where a passage helped so much in identifying and dating structures. Our decision to attribute that layer to Solomon was based primarily on the First Kings passage, the stratigraphy, and the pottery. As an archaeologist, I cannot imagine a greater thrill than working with the Bible in one hand and the spade in the other."
The three cities subsequently became accepted as type sites, and the pottery found near the Solomonic gates became the accepted standard for the 10th century BCE. But in the decades after Yadin's original idea, some archaeologists have questioned the Solomonic identification, due in part to the discovery of more gates at Ashdod and Lachish. Did Solomon build those too? The Lachish gate may date to the 10th century if one concludes that the so-called Stratum 4 falls in this period, but other archaeologists prefer to date the gate to the 9th century. Other gates uncovered at Dan and Beersheba also have similar designs as the so-called Solomonic gates, along with additional features. At Beersheba, Dan, Dor, Megiddo, and Timnah, the number of chambers decreases from 6 to 4 and are dated to the beginning of the following century. The entrances become more complex, with large towers in front of the gates, a right-angled bend in the road inside the gate entrance itself at Tel Dan, and perhaps even an inner gate at Tel Dan and later Lachish. As controversy over the gates continued to swirl, Yadin's protege, Amnon ben Tor, continued to excavate at Hatzor. He insisted that regardless of who built it, the gate must be dated to the 10th century. Once that's established, we can then reason, as he does, if there is a biblical story that can be correlated to this date, and if Solomon appears in that story, then the burden of proof rests not on those who conclude that Solomon was the builder, but on whoever says otherwise. Of course, the minimalists still declare otherwise, and the battle for Solomon goes on.